Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. Happy Sunday. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about dreams, as I had announced in my previous video, a video from yesterday. In fact, I had originally intended to tackle dreams as part of that video about the unconscious and how the unconscious influences our daily lives across a lifetime. But it turns out, that I was took me time to approach everything that I wanted to approach, and as a result, I had to defer the discussion of dreams to this episode. But as you're going to see, there's a deep link between how Jung conceives of the, an interaction between the conscious and the unconscious, and the relation that we have to our dreams, and to how our dreams relate to our daily lives, and to the meaning that we make of our lives. I'll probably be tackling some differences between the Freudian approach, which admittedly I master a bit less, and I'm relying on Jung's interpretation of Freud, which we always have to keep in mind is Jung's interpretation. It doesn't mean that he got things right in such a way that Freud would have agreed with Jung's interpretation. So that I just wanted to add this little proviso. And before I move on, just remember that I have written 2 books on the INFJ personality, the Ecstatic Soul, and my new novel, The Infinite Castle. Both are available at the links below for less than $10. All the Amazon links provided. Thank you for your support. You can also follow me on Patreon if you want to help me continue producing videos, support my channel. You can become a subscriber, and thank you to my current subscribers. Okay, so before we move on to the topic of dreams, I just want to briefly recapitulate what I had said about the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious in the previous video, because this will be helpful to kind of following what's going on in this video. So one thing that actually I had mentioned in a video before, that is in the past, not necessarily yesterday, is that Jung distinguishes between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. So the personal unconscious is where we have contents that are our subliminal perceptions, our repressed feelings and emotions, whereas the collective unconscious is where the archetypes reside, and these are forms of behavior, patterns of behavior that apply across, according to Jung, across all cultures. It has a universal aspect to it. Now, within the more personal unconscious is where we have our complexes. Now, the complexes being unconscious constellations of contents that is usually endowed with a certain affective charge. So it would often be contents that we've repressed, and that tends to aggregate with other contents that are similar to the other repressed contents to form a complex, such as, again, the most familiar would be a mother complex, a father complex, but there are many other complexes, as many complexes as there are potential real life, real world sources to be ashamed of, or scared of, or to want to repress, essentially. So in the personal unconscious of each person, there'll be certain complexes that are very similar, across people. And then there will be complexes that are quite specific to each person. And Jung has developed, or had developed, a quite powerful method to identify complexes in people, which he called the association test, which means that he would set an experiment where someone would be asked, like a sort of a subject would be asked to respond with a one letter, not a one letter, a one word, give a one word response to a word that Jung would say. He'd have a list of 100 words curated. Could be anything, could be water, daughter, pity, road. It could be any number of words, any variety of words, usually 100 of them. And the subject would be asked to just respond with a single word. Okay. So that's the kind of concept of the association. And what Jung would be particularly interested in is looking at, first of all, the word that is said in response, how much time the person needed to say the word, And whether or not the person actually said any word, right? So the reaction time, but actually whether there was success in providing a word. And in fact, he would then do a subsequent test to check whether the person remembered the answer they gave, right? And he was particularly interested in those cases where the person could not remember. And usually what indicates that you're hitting a complex with certain words is reaction time is longer. So maybe on average, a person will have a 3-4 seconds reaction time. In the case of getting nearer a complex, you're talking 12, 15 seconds. Failures to say anything quite often happens. And another that I forgot is to respond, but not obeying the rule. So the person would answer with a sentence or just a string of words instead of just a single word. And during the second test, failure to remember what one had said, also indicative of a complex. Anyway, so that's a technique that he used all his life to identify complexes in people. The thing about dreams is that it's just in the same way that there's a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious in Jung. There also are dreams that are of a more personal nature and dreams that are of a more collective nature. And it's not always easy to distinguish these because dreams by their very nature tend to be fluid and chaotic and symbolic and to not always make a lot of sense, to require some kind of interpretation. So it actually, he's said to have recorded 80,000 of his dreams, something that you read sometimes. Anyway, Jung spent a lot of time analyzing dreams of his own dreams and the dreams of his patients. And he was led to these conclusions on the basis of, at least we can say, like a vast amount of data. Now, when it comes to the dreams of the personal unconscious, I would say that there are two main types of dreams of the personal unconscious. The first one is the dream that has a pretty transparent meaning. I think that this is something that all of us would be familiar with. Sometimes go to sleep. A lot of the time we don't remember our dreams at all. But sometimes we do remember our dreams, but the meaning seems pretty plain. It involves a scene that is perfectly understandable, maybe something that happened to us recently and we're reinterpreting it in our dreams, or it just reflects something, or maybe something that will happen soon and the dream is kind of reflecting our anticipation of how it will happen or how we hope it will happen. In these cases, it can have an element of what Freud called wish fulfillment, meaning that dreams have the function of fulfilling certain wishes. Some of these wishes can be more or less repressed by what what Freud calls the censor, in which case certain, for example, people in the dream will be swapped with completely different people to hide the fact that, this is the actual wish, because we might be ashamed of this wish. But in any case, there are, for Jung, like dreams whose content is pretty transparent, and there's no need to try to look for a super deep or layered interpretation, okay? And I think that we can accept that, pretty much. Then there's the slightly different kinds of dreams, which Jung calls prospective dreams. And these dreams are, first of all, that's a very different conception from Freud. There is a very clear point of departure here between the Freudian interpretation of dreams and the Jungian interpretation of dreams. Because for Freud, there's no such thing as a prospective dream. Dream that sort of is trying to tell you what you should be doing, right? Not necessarily what will happen, but what would be better for you to do in order to make something happen that will be in your interest. Doesn't sound very scientific. It, at first blush, sounds a bit woo-woo, I suppose. And it's no surprise that Freud, who saw himself as very rigorously scientific and empirical, rejected that idea. For Freud, interpretation of dreams is analytical. Insofar as dreams mean something, you take the symbols and you try to see what's behind the symbols, the basic components of the dreams. You analyze, meaning you deconstruct the various elements, and you try to see what the dream is meaning, whether it's wish fulfillment or trying to censor a particularly shameful thought or fearful thought. For Jung, sometimes the dream is not trying to hide something. That's a difference that he has with Freud. the dream is trying to tell you something. So for example, someone could be neurotic about their job situation, or rather they could be neurotic without knowing in their conscious life why they're being neurotic. Oh, I'm in a relationship, I have cats, like this beautiful cat behind me that you can't see. I earn a good wage, I live in a nice country, why am I neurotic? And it might be, for example, that you actually don't like your job. Something as simple as that. But we know that sometimes something can be very simple, and yet if we are not inclined to want to face that truth, because maybe a part of us is afraid of thinking like, oh my God, I'd have to start applying for other jobs, and maybe in my line of work, there's not a lot of jobs of that kind, so I better really just convince myself that my job is actually fine, it's not making me unhappy, I'm just overthinking it. A lot of the time we do this subconsciously. We don't even have to kind of reflect on it or, ratiocinate. But we might still experience some negative emotion. Falls down into the unconscious, so far as it's repressed, forms a complex. For Jung, a complex, just like the unconscious as a whole, and that's something that's different from the Freud interpretation again. And it's been a criticism of Jung by a lot of people, a lot of scientists, a lot of philosophers to this day, is that sometimes you get the sense that, like, for Jung, there's not just one subject, but multiple subjects. There's the ego, there's like how I operate in my life, but the unconscious is another subject that makes its own decisions. And in fact, looking further into the unconscious seems to the personal unconscious populated by different complexes, each of which have their autonomy, right? And then there's the collective unconscious, which has yet a different kind of agency, which is not a subjective agency, but a more collective kind of agency, which is quite difficult to kind of quite penetrate, but it's a fascinating topic to explore. In any case, the complexes themselves have a kind of autonomy, and they're capable, maybe not so much of like thinking like we do, but of pushing messages, of trying to express themselves. And in the dream that is perspective, often the way that the unconscious will manifest these complexes is that it will manifest these complexes with a kind of symbolic story of what should be done. So you could experience a dream, and I'm not even going to try to provide a symbolic description because it's extremely difficult to do that in articulate language with articulate grammar, but essentially the dream would be symbolically interpretable as indicating to the person that they ought to do something about their job, or they ought to do something about their mother that they haven't talked to, or they ought to break up with this person that's making them unhappy. So that this is the key aspect of appreciating Jung's approach to dreams in this case is that he gives dreams massive importance. Now, Freud was the pioneer in rehabilitating dreams as an enormously rich source of psychological information. But Jung goes further than Freud in saying it's not just about analysis, it's about understanding the prospective nature of dreams. The dreams are often the unconscious attempt to resolve a neurosis that we cannot resolve by ourselves in our conscious world, because the mechanisms that we devise in our conscious experience to adapt to the world are often ill-suited. They contribute further to neurosis. Right? So we might think we're adapted to a situation, but actually, in fact, we're making a sacrifice that creates a neurotic condition. By the principle of compensation, the unconscious is trying to fix it, but because the unconscious is not operating at a level of high resolution, it can only operate by symbols. So the prospective meaning of the unconscious messaging in dreams is to be accessed through exegesis and interpretation of the symbols in order to render that low resolution amorphous meaning into articulable language, such as a psychotherapist might do, or a Jungian psychotherapist might do, to tell the patient or to guide the patient toward understanding that this is maybe what you yourself through your unconscious are telling yourself that you should do. So the prospective dimension of dreams is really the key insight and the key takeaway that you should take from this video, and that separates Jung from Freud. I would love to hear what you think, because at first sight, a lot of people might think, he's going a bit far. I can be on board with the idea that dreams are, revealing things about ourselves, and that a lot of these things are things that are censored by our conscious experience, and that exploring the censored content might help to, our therapeutic recovery. That would be more of a Freudian approach. But to add to that there's this prospective dimension of dreams is something, that is fascinating. But do we agree with it? And maybe someone even has experience. Let's see if, just like Jung met people that had those experiences, maybe in my following there are people who did have those experiences. I want to talk more about archetypal dreams, but as you can see, the video is already long, so I'm going to play that card again and tell you next weekend, if there is interest, I'll talk more about the dreams that are supposed to be representative, not of your personal unconscious, whether analytical or perspective, but representative of a collective unconscious. The dreams, in other words, of prophets. See you then, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day.